Welcome, everyone, back to the Everyone Wins podcast. This is David Spickard. It's great to have you again join with us. It's a fun time for Rob and I to have these conversations as we've begun this podcast and laying a foundation of what we have been discussing in our Just Leadership groups and going deeper with the topics. And as you guys know, since our last time, we have been discussing this article from Tim Keller called A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory, something that we discuss in our groups really at a high level. To take some time for Rob and me to go deeper has been a great exercise for us too. As you all know, Rob Shields has been such a help for me and have been a part of our groups as we engage with these topics, and we wanted to continue to flesh out some last points from that article since we didn't get to it last time. So we're back on our episode. I didn't realize at the beginning that we were going to be on video, so I didn't quite, look at my appearance or look in the camera as much as I am doing now. And today I brought out my new glasses. So I wanted, for those of you who are going to be seeing this on video, you can see my new look. I'm feeling quite more mature. And
is this going to be the Zuckerberg? Like, is it going to be the thing you put on every time you record where you don't have to think about it and waste brain power?
Yeah, exactly.
I love it.
I had a moment last week where I kept looking myself in the mirror and said, man, I look good. I look pretty good.
You definitely should lead with that. Whatever makes you feel comfortable, right?
So anyway, but if you're just listening audio, you'll just have to wait to see my
imagine the outfit.
So Rob, how are you doing? You doing okay?
Yeah. I'm excited to be back. This is a real joy and a privilege for me. I mean, honestly, it's so good for me to sit with this information in a like for myself. I feel like I'm here to learn as much as we are to talk about and kind of invite others into that journey. So this article has so much, and it's good to go through it slowly. And I'm really glad that we're making the time to not rush through, because honestly, if you rush through it, you're not really letting it sink into the soil, and really kind of feed the roots of your soul in ways that are going to bear fruit, which is the whole point, right? Like, we want this to change our hearts, change the way we believe about the world and kind of the theory of change that God has about how the world broke and how we're going to make it right, as ushering in the kingdom. And man, a lot of that is here in this article. It's crazy. This is like its own textbook. It's nuts how dense this is. And we're gonna take our hammers or our whatever you do, whatever tool miners use. What's that thing called? It's not the Grim Reaper thing. But you know what I'm saying? It looks kind of like it.
Yeah.
Neither of us are miners, so we don't know what the term is.
Yeah.
But we're gonna take some type of sharp tool, and we're gonna keep hitting the ground for the gold, because there's a lot of gold in this article. So, like you said, David, we're keeping going on Landing the Plane Part 2. Part 1 of this conversation was more about reviewing the four, kind of an overview of justice, the four types of secular theories of justice throughout the ages, really. I mean, I don't know how he did it, where he covered all of human history and said, these are basically the four types. Spending the most time on what's most prevalent now, which is postmodern theory, which is what you see. It's not being talked about explicitly, but it is in the air, right? It's the air we breathe in society right now. So we spent the most time talking about that theory and the limitations of that theory, where that falls short.
It's about power.
Yeah,
which is the big
essentially
topic.
Is about power, and it's a binary of you're the oppressed or the oppressor, and you're stuck in those. But this limitation of it's man-made, and it's culturally, of the moment. But human-made means it's got some serious limitations to it, and really doesn't get at the flourishing that God intended around biblical justice. And so we talked about the components of biblical justice, the 5 of those that are mentioned in the article. But we didn't really get to a ton of time, which is why we press pause of what we're going to get to today, which is why is biblical justice better than all of these alternatives? Everything that man could throw at justice and all the theories it's come up with and the entire history of humankind, why is biblical justice rooted in something more true? And why is it kind of this real story that lasts and has lasted and will continue to last? Because I think for me, that's where we don't spend enough time here. The conversation we're going to have today, people who care about justice and believers who care about justice, we can fall into this trap of honestly spending more time researching what we're against. Like, oh, I need to know about critical theory. I need to know about this. I need to know about that. And you know more about and so you spend your time becoming an expert in what doesn't give life. But then you're like, well, what does give life? What does lead to human flourishing? And we're like, Jesus, like we don't really have very well thought out definitions for what biblical justice is and how much it's all throughout Scripture. And we're doing ourselves a disservice. I think we're missing out significantly. So I'm really thankful and glad that we're going to spend time unpacking these four points that kind of hit at why biblical justice is better than all the alternatives. So you ready to just dive right in? Anything else to add before we roll up our sleeves?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of thoughts. One is I love the idea. So this is what we're for. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One is to have a greater perspective of what biblical justice is so that we can articulate it to others, people around us, even our friends, our family. We just feel like we have the language, we have the understanding that gives us a foundation to have solid conversations with people that are wrestling with these issues. And again, doing that in a winsome way, we hope that is not combative. It's not, being defensive. It's not because we're trying to win an argument, but because we're just trying to help people understand the breadth of the way God has designed justice.
Almost and then the beautiful, second, right? Like winsome and beautiful. It gives people a picture that like wins their hearts.
Absolutely. Yeah. Draws people in. The second, and I would say the most important reason for us to have this conversation is because we all, and I'm thinking primarily of myself, need to be rewired around these ideas so that they become second nature. They become part of who I am. We talk about this a good bit in our groups, how justice is not what we do, it's who we are. It becomes a part of our DNA. And I'm just realizing more and more, even though I think about these things a lot, I've got a long way to go in understanding how these principles can become part of who I am and how I operate, and a little bit more second nature. And this takes time, it takes discussion, it takes understanding, it takes this kind of conversation. So this is why we wanted to wrap this part up by going through these four principles.
Yeah, I love that. It's really an invitation for anybody listening or watching to us we're self-diagnosing. Hey, how are we? Where are we at? And inviting you into that process of our own personal growth, right? In from a real deep sense of humility that we don't have this figured out. This is not a master class on all the ways you need to be like David and Rob. This is, man, we're broken. We fall short of this every day, but we have gotten a glimpse of this beautiful picture, and we want to run towards it. And we know that it's going to take community to do that. It's going to take a team effort because it's so countercultural, right? And if we're not, and this has got to be a part of our formation, and it's got to make its way into our habits, which means we've got to really think deeply on this and think about it often if it's going to really form us and change us into who God is inviting us to be, to then change our worlds respectively, right? Whether they be big or small, no matter how big your platform is. I think that's the invitation the Lord wants, is for each of us to change the world around us in the process of changing our own hearts, right?
For sure.
All right. You ready to dive into this thing?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Part two. So where we left off was talking about the limitations of critical theory. And I think it's worth revisiting just that where we landed the plane. That last point was talking about how much it can be really highly performative around an identity, like it can be very self-righteous. It also is prone to domination. I mention that because that's the exact counter of what biblical justice does. And we're going to revisit that here in a second. But there's basically 4 main points that the article talks about when it comes to comparing, again, the most prominent secular theory, which is postmodern, which is all about power, comparing that to what biblical justice is. But it also, he makes the first point is basically that biblical justice addresses all the concerns of justice that's found across all of the views. So what all the views are grasping at, they have aspects of truth, right? None of them are absent of truth and are just completely false end to end. All of them have, and like, oh, some of that tastes good when you're drinking. Oh yeah, that's palpable because they're hints of it, but none of them strike the full note, right, of truth. They all have limitations to it, but not biblical justice. Biblical justice includes all of the truth from all the human-made forms of justice and the socially constructed ones, because it's the ultimate reality, right? Like it's because God exists and God created this world. Therefore, of course, these are grounded in God and who He is, right? So
it's the Jesus answer. It's the Jesus answer.
Yeah, because Jesus, right? Because God, and that really is true in this.
But it's deep, it's full, it's comprehensive, and that's you make an interesting point that there's still some truths in the secular theories, but they're not completely true. They don't hold all of these things together. So as we're engaging with folks, there is some way, there's some natural ways in which we can have common agreement around some of these ideas.
Yes.
So we don't completely dismiss them. But we
establish
have to
common ground with someone who may not be coming from a worldview that is Christ-centered, right?
Yeah, so if somebody feels that justice is about fairness, or justice is centered around power, or justice is centered around equity, there is some truth in each of those ideas, and so we don't have to be so combative, but we have the opportunity to help people and ourselves see a broader picture of what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's really good because it's hard to talk about our cultural today, right? It's just really tough. It feels like you're navigating landmines and having these conversations, which leads to a lot of fear and hesitation of even touching this. Let's just leave this alone. Let's just leave it alone. And, for people who have the luxury and the privilege of doing that may work for a time, but it's not a real solution, right? It's like sweeping stuff under the rug. It doesn't actually help you progress or help those around you progress. Doesn't lead to flourishing when you bury this stuff. And I don't think God wants us to bury it. He didn't bury it. He's talking about it all the time in Scripture. And the stuff that He talks about that is clearly dear to His heart, that means we need to be about that stuff and be comfortable talking about it. And so I think that's a great point. It reminds me of a conversation we had on the Just podcast of author who authored a book, Communicating for Change, and just talking about how much we've got to really seek to find common ground with people who really, we may have a lot of problems with their theology or their worldview or the way they approach the world. Like, we got to start with what do we have in common, and make sure we're coming in not looking down on them, but motivated to actually build a bridge, right? In humility. So first point is, hey, it's got all of them. All the truth from all the theories are wrapped up in biblical justice. It's the most complete. And then the second point is this idea of being holistic. So that I'll go ahead and, show you in typical Keller fashion that the last 3 points are, it's going to be focused on being holistic, how it safeguards against domination, and then how it really subverts in a radical way our understanding of power. So if you're paying attention, the buzzwords are going to be holistic, domination, and power. And those are the ones we're going to spend our time. And I'd love to hear you kind of expand more about your experience and your perspective on these, David. So this first one, holistic. Keller talks about this idea that biblical justice is significantly more well-grounded because it's based on God's character, which is a moral absolute. These other theories are all grounded in man-made, which means they change with the winds of human culture. Mm-hmm. And he even, I mean, when you read the article, you see it. Like these things are evolving constantly based on what's the new hot take, right, of that day and time. What are people all about? But that's constantly changing based on new information. And so this one is rooted in something, in a God that never changes, which means it transcends time, which is so cool.
No, and again, we cover this central to why justice is so important, that it's part of who God is, that he says, I am the God of justice. Mm-hmm. That's pretty clear. And it's what he loves. He says, I love justice in Isaiah 61. So rooted in God's character provides just a solid grounding for the way we think about what biblical justice is.
Yeah. And this idea of holistic is, it doesn't, all the other theories you're talking about are kind of reductive. Like they're narrow. They really are, they make you pick one passion, right? Whether that's I'm about individual rights or the individual, right? I'm about society. I'm about the environment. I'm about people's spiritual condition. All of that is under the umbrella of biblical justice. It doesn't make you choose one of those.
Right.
They all matter to God because he created all of it. He created the world. Creation matters to him. People's souls matter to him. Social structures matter to him. All of it. And so that's so cool that you don't have to pick one and ignore the other, which is what when a man-made theories are always forcing you to do, is choose one and turn the volume down on the other, which is kind of what I felt all the time. I don't know about you, David, like navigating the nonprofit sector, you kind of feel like, yeah, people are all about one of those things, but like, I don't know. Let's talk about, bringing and changing structures, but you're not really allowed to show up with your faith and how like God is center to your driving force of your wanting to care for the poor. That was a great example for me. It felt incomplete. Right. A lot of times in my work, I couldn't feel like I could be my whole self, or really the whole picture of this was wanted in a lot of conversations. But it's sad because you feel like, man, we're missing the boat on the full picture of the beauty here.
Again, it comes back to the both and idea. And all those things matter. I think, going back to my experience leading Jobs for Life, we were about poverty, we're about joblessness, we're about unemployment, underemployment. So it's also good to be really focused on an issue of injustice, because we couldn't do it all.
It's not bad to champion a specific cause with specific strengths, right?
For sure. But we knew that we were just a part of a piece. It was just we were cog in the wheel and the overall, movement toward making things as they were supposed to be, more just. And where we struggled, honestly, is when we were part of a broader system that wasn't doing that, that didn't see that moving other pieces that affect the way someone goes to work was also necessary. So at Jobs for Life, for example, we're doing more now than we used to at the beginning, where we're really helping employers understand how they need to create places of work that are more just and are places where people really thrive when they go to work, and understand the barriers that people, particularly from low-income backgrounds, face in order for them to be great employees. If we only just train people to work, but we didn't help them go to a place where they could thrive, then we may not have solved the problem. But how much can you do of that? You're limited in what you're able to do. You have to trust other people are pursuing their causes in a manner that's pursuing biblical justice. But as we know, we don't live in a world that's guided by these principles, so it becomes very, very challenging. But the concept, the idea still remains. It's all God's. He wants it all for his glory and his purpose, and to be how he's intended. And he gives us foretastes of that as we pursue it, even though ultimately we operate within a broken world.
Mm. All right, I got a quote here, and I really can't wait to hear you react to it. Because I know you've gotten reps with this view I know you've experienced a lot of pushback with this statement. Biblical justice provides a unique understanding of the character of wealth and ownership that does not fit into either modern categories of capitalism or socialism.
Oh, man.
I got thoughts, but before I share mine, I would love to just say, I would love to hear your reaction to that. And in your experience working with our cohorts, right, of people who are in leadership, Christians who are in leadership, are people pushing up against that statement? If so, how? Are they cognizant of that? Or is it under the surface, kind of just in the air? Biblical justice and capitalism, are they the same thing?
Are they the same thing? No, they're not the same thing. Does that mean capitalism is not good? No, not necessarily. There are a lot of good things about capitalism. But there are limitations too. Mm-hmm. And, as you get into these conversations, man, it can really start to feel like you're going down this slope of whether people are believing a certain ideology like capitalism or socialism is the way to go, but all of those have good things and all of those have not so good things because they're just limited.
Man-made, right? Back to the idea of anything man-made is going to have limitations when it's not God-made.
For sure. And, again, the slippery slope of how these conversations end up being a little bit political because of the way we approach them or just the lens through which we're entering into these conversations. But at the end of the day, I think where we find the most, what I would say, richest conversations is how we pursue this idea of biblical justice in a world that doesn't operate by these principles, and therefore how should we operate in order to be competitive in the marketplace, have thriving businesses, be able to have impact, be able to be profitable, because you have to be profitable in business in order to create jobs, and it's why you go into business. Money is not bad. It's the love of money and how we steward it is the issue. So the complex conversation about how are you just as a just leader and how you stay competitive is an interesting conversation to have. Because sometimes there's a sense that those don't operate in the same category, or you can't do one and then have the other. You might have to compromise. And what do you compromise? You compromise not being competitive so that you can be just, or are you going to compromise being just to be competitive? I don't know. We could have a whole episode on that whole idea of how we think through that question, and where do we come out in the end? Yeah, but I think that's where we get to as we talk through these things, particularly in a business context.
It really, as you're talking, it's almost like a plug for another Keller resource, Counterfeit Gods, right? Because you established early on, we're here to look into a mirror, identify where are the gaps in our thinking and our belief system that really drive our behavior, and where does it fall short of God, and how do we become and be formed into more of His likeness? I think it really means we got to do some self-reflection. It's like, where are my blind spots? Where are my idols? Where are the things that are more primary in my heart than they should, and that maybe even supersede God? We all have them, so we can do that in a safe space, because God is safe to do that with. He's inviting us in a journey or where are the I heard a talk recently talked about where are the high places, right, that are torn down in the Old Testament. We all have those in our hearts, and they need to be torn down. Which means, sometimes we can see politics or a certain type of economic structure. They can start to take on too much of a primary identity in our worldview. And I think there's a belief that drives that, right? That we need to really be able to dig down and be willing to look at and say, what's behind that? Do I have a problem with power? Is greed there? What is that primary kind of core idol that is driving the way I view the world and that has formed how I form my opinions? And we just got to be able to take an honest assessment of that. And we all have those. And so it's not just picking on capitalists or socialists here, because we're not really upholding one or the other here. We're saying, hey, both of them fall short of what biblical justice is. But I think in the cultural waters that we swim in, we also need to name that, man, there's some examples of where Christianity has gotten into bed with culture in ways that are really detrimental.
Yeah.
And they're not the same. And they shouldn't be the same, because one of them is constantly changing and the other is eternal, right?
It's really hard to see all that.
It is, because you're in the water. It's like that fish analogy, right? Where like those two fish are like, hey, how are you enjoying the water? He's like, what's water, right? Because when you're a fish, you don't know what water is, because it's everywhere, and that's. But I think it is. Let's not lose hope either, because I think God does. Sight is possible here, but I think it is going to take some radical steps, which you talk about in the cohorts, of almost like a radical displacement and decentering of yourself to gain sight. Like, you're not going to be able to figure this. You're not going to be able to just look into a mirror and see all this stuff for yourself. You've got to really be radical in your diversification of who you let into your life and where you displace yourself, and so that you're able to let the Lord speak through other people to grow you.
Right.
So anyway, that's number one. There's a lot to it, but I think we probably need to move on. Well, number one is kind of this holistic nature of biblical justice. The second point he makes is that biblical justice has built-in safeguards against domination. So kind of this whole idea of like working through our lives with heaven in the not rear view, but heaven in the forefront of, like, this is the goal we're working towards. Because this idea that if you don't believe that eventually God is going to undo and make all the sad things come untrue, right? And make all the wrong things right one day, then you're just gonna grab for whatever you can if this earth is all that there is. But we as Christians are invited into this different. We can resist this urge to kind of dominate and fix everything, because honestly, Christianity doesn't claim that if we follow its playbook, all of our problems are going to be fixed. It never says that. We know eventually He's going to right every wrong, but not on this side of heaven are we promised that. So we're not actually working on the goal to fully fix the world. We actually don't believe it's going to happen, which is kind of can be seen as a downer a little bit. Like, we're going to fail at this goal.
No, wait a second, Rob. We're not here to fix things.
I think we're here to show people what God's kingdom is and usher in the kingdom in a way that does advance towards flourishing without fully realizing the goal. What do you think? That's how I would word it.
Well, I mean, I interject because we need to not just pass over this idea.
It's kind of big.
Flippantly.
Yeah.
And, as I think about this for myself, this is one of those where it's easy for me not to see the motivations that I have, where I even derive my value, because I believe that, my job is to fix leaders. It's to come alongside leaders and help them grow and become better leaders. And of course, that's a noble thing. Of course, I need to pursue that. But I do that with the mindset that I'm sort of I can think of myself almost like a savior.
Yeah.
Like, I'm here to have impact, and my life is valuable if I have that impact. My life is valuable if I'm successful. My life is valuable if I fix this broken thing and make it better. And even with my good intentions, where I show up to do the things that I do, I don't realize how self-focused I am. And so that's where this plays out for me, that if I don't have this right perspective, that God is going to make all things new, that we do live in a broken world, that we are to create those foretastes of God's kingdom, that yes, we pursue justice, yes, we pursue things to be fixed in that they're meant to be as they're intended to be. But we do so with the mentality that we know that not everything is going to be fixed. We know too that it's not all about me. It's all about God, and that ultimately He's going to make all things new. Then it completely changes my sense of value on who I am and what I do, and how I even approach what it means to be just.
And that's why I think Christianity is so I don't know, exciting may not be the right word, but when you compare it to every other justice theory that is made by humans, it says we can fit. We're the answer. This theory, this idea of justice, if we only focus on this, power, fairness, you go to equity, this will fix the world, which is like so much hubris, right? Because you're the ones that came up with the idea, and you're saying, yeah, my idea is the right one. And if this theory is everybody's theory, then the whole world's going to be this utopian place, right? It elevates man, and God is nowhere to be found, right? Because it's their idea. Christianity comes in and it's the exact opposite. We're not the center of the story. We see God as a huge God that actually is one day going to create this beautiful utopia of heaven, right? And the kingdom one day. But we're not, and He's inviting us to be a part of that, but we're not gonna, when you come into a mentality, the reason the other theories are prone to domination is there's this weight of, we got to fix this, and we got to get this out there, and we got to get all these other people are the problem, and they kind of just need to get on our bandwagon, or you're for us or you're against us. Christianity does not allow you the luxury of picking up that worldview where you're just like, yeah, we're the right ones and everyone else is an enemy. It's like, no, we're all the enemy against God, but because God reacted to us in grace, we then we are invited in to react and treat others with grace, right, and humility, and say we're all the problem, right? It's not you're the problem. It's I'm starting with I'm the problem, and you also are the problem, but I'm not leading with that, right? I'm starting with the posture of I'm the messed up one. I'm going to come to you in humility, and I'm also going to it's almost like more relaxed in a way, not in the like a laissez-faire, we don't care what happens to the world because we're all going to get to heaven one day, but like we can chill a little bit knowing that God's going to ultimately right it all in the end. It's almost like we're free, not relaxed. I'd say we're freed up to love people better than I think all other theories do. And I think history, look all throughout history as like anyone that doesn't base it on God doesn't love neighbor well because they end up pressing and dominating people who are against them. And Christianity does the exact opposite of that, which is so beautiful in how rare it is, right?
For sure. That freedom doesn't lead to resignation. Like things are broken, so there's nothing we can do. We're just going to live our lives and not worry about the outcome because the outcome has already been won. It also doesn't lead to frenetic, like stressed out, anxious living to try to fix things that we can't fix.
Which is a callback to episode 1. It actually makes rest possible.
Absolutely.
You have to have that in mind of like who ultimately is going to fix this in the end. Is it me or is it God? Because if it's me, I can never rest.
And in that freedom, therefore, you can fully lament. You can...
That's its own episode right there. We got to come back to that one day.
you can cry out to God for the brokenness that we see and experience. We can ask him to change things because it's all about him. And we can do that with trust, knowing that he has the power and the ability to make things right, knowing that he will make things right. So it's this freedom that gives us, a proper sense of urgency that is mixed in with this idea that the victory has been won, and should allow us then to again have a spirit of joy and peace and presence and patience that allows us to navigate these messy waters without getting so undone by them or frustrated by them, or get to the point where it's that forget it, I'm done.
And I think lastly on this point, before we move to the final one, is this idea that Scripture, like this pressure that maybe we can feel as believers of like, hey, we got to get our worldview, and like it needs to become dominant, and we got to, like, we're going to change the world through becoming more powerful. That actually is not what Jesus did. Look at Philippians 2 as a great example verse of there, right? And all throughout Scripture, almost every example, the whole storyline, the way that Keller puts in the article, the whole storyline of the Bible is God's repeated identification with the powerless and the marginalized. Over and over again, God's deliverers are usually racial and social outsiders, people who are seen to be weak and rejected in the eyes of the powerful elites of the world. So that fundamentally means that we need to take the pressure off ourselves. It's like the answer is not more power. Actually, the answer is the opposite. I think God prefers to use people who actually are powerless, because that's where he gets the glory. So he doesn't need powerful people at all. He can use them and is inviting them too. I mean, clearly there's so many invitations, Jesus interacting with powerful people. The invitation was on the table, right? The rich young ruler, Nicodemus, like these are folks who had money, had power, had influence. They're invited, but those folks don't need to put the pressure on themselves. It's like, oh yeah, it's actually, I'm God's plan A because I got those things. I don't think that's actually true. I don't think Scripture validates that, right? Which is humbling.
Yeah, again, we need to sit in that. God doesn't use powerful people. I need to not brush that by. I think even about, who I pursue in relationship, because so much of us think that, we need to be around and with people of power, people of influence, and who ultimately has power that we might overlook.
Yeah. Who is God using? Because that's who he's always used through the course of history, that is not in my social circle, that I'm missing out on seeing all of who God is and joining him in what he's doing in the world, because I actually only know other powerful people.
Right.
And that might be a weird word to say. Like, people may not go around saying I'm powerful, but I think it's something we need to recognize, that in the wealthiest country in the world, and if you are at a certain income level or higher, right? You are white, you are male, like these are just things. If you're checking off these boxes like you and I do, then we carry so much power societally, right? And that can let us believe that we're doing fine and we're good. We're set. We're the people that need to be interviewed on podcasts, because we just need to go talk about how awesome we are and how other people need to become like us, right? Which your friend Brian Ficker talks about. We bring a broken worldview into how we, try to alleviate things like poverty, because we think the answer is to make poor people like us.
Right.
And nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, the opposite is true. We need to become more like them, right? So there's I think you're exactly right. We need to sit with that. And if you're listening to this, what questions does that bring up, or what hesitations and wrestle with those with the Lord, wrestle those, in your next Just Leadership cohort, bring it up, talk about it, pray about it, see what God might be doing in your heart. So, all right, landing the plane here. Last point he talks about when it comes to why biblical justice is better as it compares to kind of secular theories is that only biblical justice offers a radically subversive understanding of power. So Keller says, because it is rooted in the death and resurrection of Jesus, Christianity neither eliminates nor merely reverses the ruler/ruled binary. Rather, it subverts it. So it doesn't just throw it away. It subverts it. When Jesus saved us through his use of power only for service, he changes our attitude towards and our use of power. All right, David, unpack that for us. What is he talking about here?
Well, Jesus' power was a power that was reflected in his death, right? So the power he calls us to is a power that dies. Dies to ourself.
I like that. A power that dies. That's a punchy and powerful right there.
So, we've talked about this in our groups, and we mentioned this before, I think in the last episode, with looking at the postmodern theory of secular theory of justice that's so focused on power, and that the idea of being just is just move power from one group to another. Basically, if you have power, you're not just. If you don't have power, you've been the oppressed, and so we just need to redistribute power. But if that power is a dominating power, one that subverts others, then you haven't changed anything. You
it's just a cycle, right? Yep.
Repositioned where people are being oppressed, where they're being dominated, and we haven't fixed anything. So we have to then understand a whole different idea of what power is in order to understand what biblical justice is. And so this is a whole section that we talk about when we talk about giving away power, that the idea of, which is so relevant in our society, you hear this all the time, leaders need to give away power. But if we don't define what that power is, and that it's a power to die power, a power that decreases so that others increase, one that allows for people to flourish and is completely others-centered, then we will experience what God intends through biblical justice. What's interesting is, as we talk about this idea, I quickly looked up the idea, just Googled giving away power, and immediately what pops up are statements like, don't ever give away your power. The last thing you want to do is give away your power. There are all these graphics that talk about how, if you give up your power, you're giving up yourself, and you don't need to have people have that kind of power over you. And what you see in those statements is this idea that power in our culture is so tied to identity, and that people find their identity in the way that or their value and the way they think about their power. For believers, we know that our identity doesn't come from the power that we have. It comes from just what Jesus has done for us, that our identity is in him, that we're image bearers of God, and that we understand that our value is secure. It doesn't matter what we do, doesn't matter what we accomplish, doesn't matter even, because of the forgiveness that Jesus has provided for us. He even makes us be seen as holy and righteous, even though we're deeply sinful and turn our backs on him every day. And so we're considered precious, valuable men and women who are the apple of his eye. And we don't need, therefore, to have power be the thing that defines us. And yet that's the way in our society people are defined. So everyone would say, you're right. We don't want to don't give away your value. Of course, don't, you're precious, you're valuable, but it's not power that's at issue there. So we need to understand those differences so that we then can embrace this whole idea of power being something that is elevating of others, that is decreasing, that is disarming, instead of dominating and manipulating and trying to get our way all the time because we're due. Things like that.
Yeah.
And again, I'll say one last thing. As white men, you mentioned that before, just we have this power. We don't even know the power that we have. Like, I don't know it because it's normal.
Sure.
And I don't know the power of just being who I am in my society as it relates to race and culture that I even have that influences the way people respond to me, view me, or the ways that I can do things and not do things. And so we have to be in touch with that so that then we know how to steward it in a way that allows us to elevate those around us.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
As someone listening who's like, you're right. I don't know the power that I have. How do I find that out?
Oh, goodness. Good question. I think certainly we can ask people around us. We can wrestle with these issues that we're talking about and try to do an inventory of the things that we've done in our past, in our history, or the things that we've accomplished, and ask the question, was something else going on there that I may have missed that allowed me to have an opportunity that I thought was, easy, based on things that I did versus maybe the position that I have that I didn't realize I had. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Those are things that I that I don't even, we talk about how we see ourselves, we see our implicit biases, we see the people around us and see things in our community as just leaders. So we have to take the time to be able to see even those things in ourselves that we haven't been able to see.
Yeah. And I think it sounds simple, like you ask somebody, but honestly, this can be an incredibly hard topic to talk about and bring up, and a little taboo, right? Like if you are a person of wealth, power, or influence, I think culturally you're kind of like, you don't really highlight that. You don't talk about it. It's almost like pretend like you don't have it. But the reality is, societally, you do, and if you're not familiar in knowing how that impacts those around you and how that impacts your own heart, then you're going to be limited in your ability to be someone who is kind of helping ushering in the kingdom and the flourishing of those around you, and your community. And so I think it's something we got to break through that. We got to break through the discomfort of it, and we got to talk about it. We got to talk about the impact that it has, and we got to honestly level up on our education on the way culture talks about it, or just it's implied everywhere that, power in certain hands is inherently bad. Power in other hands is actually the only solution they need. And right. A lot of times that cuts across lines of race and class, right? Like if all the rich white guys would just give up all their power, because that's the problem. and we give it to all low-income people of color, if they have all the power, then everything's going to be great. But that's actually, it's so much more complex than that, right? And yes, do we want people who are marginalized and oppressed to be empowered? 100%, right? So I think a lot of it is like, who are you, and as you're coming to this conversation, who are you? What is your lived experience? How are you navigating this? It's going to be very different depending on where you're at, who you are, how much power you have. But I think this invitation to use whatever power we have to serve and to decenter ourselves and to come and die, like you're talking about, practically leverage our power to serve other people so that others benefit. That was the question I wrote down as you were talking, is who am I serving with the power that I have?
Yeah.
Which implies like I got to get to know the power that I have. But then once you're familiar with what power, you named it, who am I serving with the power that I have? I think that's a really good self-reflection question that maybe we could leave as we wrap up our time, because I know we're at an end here. Any final thoughts, David, as we land the plane on this article? I know it's been a lot.
No, I just, again, you can see I had a question from a really close friend of mine who was struggling with some of these issues and asked me the question, when did you get to the point where you found yourself that you weren't saying the wrong thing in certain situations because you'd wrestle with these issues and issues of justice? And I said, I haven't. I haven't gotten to that point, and, we talk about this being a journey of, what it means to become a just leader, that it's not a destination. You're not unjust one day and all of a sudden you're just. It's a journey and there's an ebb and flow. And I would just say that as we talk through all this, that we give ourselves the ability to understand that this takes time to really, figure this out in our own context and let these ideas sink in, because we're just prone to be self-focused. We're prone to want power. We want, the things that give us power, like more money and things that we think are going to satisfy us. We don't even see the things that we can't see. And, it takes a lot to unpack this for ourselves. So we need to be okay with that, not be discouraged by it, but understand it's a journey.
Yeah. And I think as my encouragement and final takeaway would be, Keller talks about in other places how, the gospel, when it really captivates our hearts, it actually ushers into our lives a path of downward mobility. Which is crazy countercultural, right? And that's that. I feel like everybody, you even hear that word, you're like, what? Like, no, like,
nobody's going to listen.
Up and to the right.
Nobody's going to listen anymore, Rob, to our next episodes. If we're
you're right. Hey, maybe we're gonna experience some of our own downward mobility. Show's canceled.
Come listen to this one. Come listen to this, and then you will be a part of downward mobility.
It's not a great pitch for corporate sponsors, that's for sure. No. But that is the way of the cross, right? That is the Savior that we claim. That was what he did, and he came and said, "Follow me, do likewise." And so, the question is, where am I experiencing downward mobility? And if I'm not, how do I get around people that are, so that I could understand what makes them tick and how they started doing that, right? Because we got to diversify, and we got to go find somebody that is doing that, whose trajectory of their life is not just up and to the right, who is experiencing downward mobility, the way of the cross, and just go and get with those folks, sit with them, learn from them. That would be, even if it's just one person.
And I would go back to your word and experience the freedom that comes with that.
And the joy, and the beauty of that's
the things that we long for. That's
where they are.
Downward mobility.
Yeah,
that's convicting for me.
All right, man. Well, thus concludes part 2. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. We're not done. A lot more justice conversations to be had, but I think we've built a really solid foundation. Some incredible guests coming down the pipeline here soon.
Yep, excited about them.
So anybody listening, stay tuned. We'll we'll have a lot of powerful content coming your way.
Yes. Thank you, Rob.
All right, David. Till next time.